In this video, we're going to talk about making a pencil roll. Of course, instead of pencils, you could put paint brushes, makeup brushes. We could make a longer one and put knitting needles in. Sort of the versatility, sort of this basic pencil roll will give you is limitless. So it's something you can play with after our first attempt. But the intention here is to give you a project that is very simplistic, only using a straight stitch. And if you've never used a machine before, this will be a task that you will easily be able to achieve. So I have a few examples here because I wanted to talk about sort of the fabric choice. Now you can see this roll here, it's quite rigid. If I tap the end, it stays, at the same length, this cylindrical shape. There's no distortion. And this is because the fabric we've used here is quite firm, whereas this sample here is soft. And if I tap that end, you can see how it collapses. So we need to be sort of considerate of that when we're making our choices. So to make it easier, I was looking for a fabric that didn't fray, so we didn't have to worry about overlocking and neatening edges. So this example, I used a felt, which is why it is soft and which is why it collapses on the end. Whereas the fabric we have here is actually two different fabrics that are bonded together. So we have the black on the one side and the fawn on the other. If you look, you can see this is a woven fabric in both instances, which would normally fray if they were on their own. But to bond them together, we use a double-sided interfacing. Often it has a brand name attached as Bondaweb. You buy this on a roll. We have an example here. It's 45 centimeters wide, and you can just buy it by the meter. Now it's on a paper. It almost feels like a greaseproof paper, a baking parchment. But on the other side, it's slightly rough, and this is where the adhesive is. So if we pull that apart, you can see the cobwebby sort of filament there of the adhesive. So you place the adhesive on your fabric, iron on the paper, then once it's cool, take the paper off, and then you put another piece of fabric on top, and then that will make something that is usually quite floppy, like our felt here, more rigid and stable. So we could use that, or fabrics that would fray are now glued together. So when we cut around that edge, it won't fray, which is the sort of fabric we're using for our examples. So that is sort of explaining a little bit of our fabric choice and why we've gone with it. Next, talk about what we're going to need and the sizes of our pattern pieces. So in this instance, I'm going to do a pencil roll as the examples above there. So I have cut my base piece of fabric here, which is the piece at the back, 45 centimeters long. So this is running parallel with the selvage. But of course, if it's waste fabric, you've got scraps left over from something else, that's fine. Just as long as this is on the straight of grain. Of course, if you've Bondawebbed it together, it'll be stable anyway. But we're not looking for this to stretch. So we've got this at 45 centimeters long. And then from top to bottom, with regards to the height, is 24 centimeters. Then my little piece inside, our holder that I'm going to stitch all our channels on, for our pencils. That is 45 because it's going to sit on top of our base. But this is 13 centimeters deep. So if we go through that again for you here on our piece of paper. So my base is 45 centimeters long. Of course, if you want to create a bigger roll, you can just make that longer. But for the sample that I'm going to construct, I've done our base at 45 centimeters long, and from top to bottom is 24 centimeters. Then for our holder, our little piece where we're going to stitch our compartments in, so that again is 45 centimeters. This is for our holder, but the height on this one is 13 centimeters. So that's our 2 pieces of fabric cut out to produce our pencil holder. Now the fabric I've got here for our little strip is what is left over from a fat quarter that I purchased, so I was able to make the scissor holder and this pencil case holder from that one fat quarter. So the first thing we're going to do is on our section here that we're going to create the holder for our pencils with is neaten this top edge. This is a fabric that will fray, and we need to ensure that all the raw edges are enclosed, or otherwise during using our pencil holder, or for example if this was on a garment, when seams fray they eventually would disintegrate and this would fall apart. So we need to make sure any raw edge that would fray is enclosed. So we're going to neaten this top edge where our pencils will go in. So what I've done, I have gone to the iron and I have pressed over 5mm all the way along our 45 centimeter edge. Then I've pressed it over again to enclose, to hide that raw edge. This is what we would call a double turn, because there's our first, there's our second, our double turn. Now I'm going to then stitch on the machine close to this edge here because I want to hold that in place. If I stitch close to this top folded edge, this can still flap about. So we want to stitch close here. And at the beginning and end of every row, we're going to do what we call a back tack. That means after we've gone forward a few stitches, we will reverse those stitches and then come forward again. That prevents the beginning and end of our seams from undoing. So we need to make sure they're secure. So our threads on the machine go between the toes of the foot and towards the back. That means they won't get tangled underneath as we start to stitch. We've got a basic stitch size, which is 2.5, and we're going to start. So the inside toe of the foot I am putting along this folded edge, so I can use that as a guide to make sure I stitch the same distance all the way down. So forward and then back, and then forward all the way down. Pressing this in place means it stays. It means I haven't got to worry about pins. So pressing is a really important part of construction. It helps to hold things in place and makes it easier for the next stage. So whenever we stop, we need to make sure that our needle is down in our work. This means if we were to lift the foot, it stays in place. If the needle was not in there, that means this would move around and you'd have a funny stitch. It would be a different size to all the others. So we keep going all the way down to the end. and as we get towards the end, we back tack, go back a few stitches in reverse. Now we lift the needle up using the wheel that's on the side of the machine, and then we can pull and it should come away from the machine easily. If it doesn't, it just means the needle's not at the highest point. So if you turn that wheel a little bit more on the side, it will release that, and the thread ends will flow out easy enough. So I've just trimmed my thread ends there, and I will go back to the beginning and trim the thread ends there, keeping our work as clean as possible as we progress. Now, when we consider this being our pencil holder, being the base, and then our little section on the top, I want to bring the black side as what I'm going to class as the right side. This is what we're going to see when it's all rolled up forward to the front. So I'm going to put right sides together. So that means face of fabrics together. And I'm going to stitch these down one of the long sides of the 45 centimetre length. Now, the distance I am going to stitch this is a centimetre seam allowance. This is what I've allowed on the pattern and with the measurements that I've given you to ensure that a pencil will still fit. If we were to go wider and take a bigger seam allowance, then we wouldn't have enough length for the pencil. So I've allowed a centimetre seam allowance on everything. And on the industrial machines here in the university with us, it's this back line of this first number 4 here from the needle, that is a centimetre. So I'm going to place these raw edges so they're together, and I'm going to place them in line with our back edge of the number 4. I'm going to go forward, reverse, and forward again. Remember, stopping always with the needle in. I'm just going to adjust, make sure our edge is together, and stitch all the way down. Back tack at our end again to make sure it's secure. Trim our thread ends, put our threads to the back of the foot, ready for the next stage, and then trim at the other end. Now I'm going to take this to the iron and I'm going to press this seam because I want to make sure we have a nice clean edge there. But then what is very important is that this seam allowance we have here needs to go down onto the base layer. So we can see there that the seam allowance is being pressed down on top of the base layer. So this means whenever we're putting a pencil or anything in this section, it will slide down over the seam allowance and not get caught. If it is the other way, and we have the seam allowance onto our little holder, as we're trying to put a pencil in, it could catch and snag on there, and it would make it difficult for our pencils to go in. So this is why, just to make sure we understand, this seam allowance will be pressed down to lay on top of our base layer. So I'm going to press that in place. Then once that's in place, I'm going to press so that it is sitting a centimetre up, giving us a little border. And then round the other 3 sides, we're also going to press a centimetre seam allowance around. So that will help us then for sewing the next stage. Really important to press to enable you to progress that much easier. So on this next stage here, now you can see I've pressed along the bottom edge. Then I have folded up the sides and then also across the top. But what you'll notice is the corners where we've pressed become really quite thick. So we're going to cut some of this away. So if we open up where we've pressed, you can see there are crease lines from the pressing. So this is why it's really important to press at this stage, because it makes this next process that much easier. So I am going to cut out this little square in the corner, because I want to reduce that thickness. So I want a nice little sharp pair of scissors for that process. So when we fold over the top edge now, and then we fold over the side, it is a lot less bulk there, and it's going to be easier to sew. And we're okay with this being a raw edge there, because we know this fabric is not going to fray. So I'm going to do that process on all the 4 corners to get rid of the bulk. So I've done that on the top right. We'll now do it on the top left. As I say, we've got our crease lines to follow. Now we're going to do the bottom edges. Now we're going to do this a little bit different. Now you can see we've got our holder in place. We've pressed this over 1 centimetre. We've got the same width of black folded over all the way along. But we can see here the wrong side of our contrast fabric, and we don't want that to be visible. So instead of just cutting out the little corner, I'm going to, on my crease line from the iron, I'm going to cut all that out. So I'm going to cut all the way down. And through the seam section here. And then across that edge there, which that represents our little square that we've seen everywhere else. So when we fold this over, and I'm making sure our seam allowance here is going down towards the base layer, this is folded up 1 centimetre. And our holder section now comes to the crease where our side panel folds over. So when we stitch this into place, it's going to hide that raw edge, but the wrong side of the fabric no longer pokes out. So we've got a nice clean edge. So if we go back round to the other side, so just we can go through this again. So we've got this pressed over our centimetre. We can see the wrong side showing through there. So using that crease from the press, we can cut down. This should work out as about 1 centimetre. Then we've got the seam, which is quite thick there. And then across at the corner, which represents our little square, which is missing the same at the top there. Okay. So that just makes it easier for when we top stitch our outer 3 sides in place. After I've trimmed the corners and the sides of our holder, I've now marked the lines I'm going to stitch to create the separate little channels. These can vary to suit whatever product you're going to put inside. But I've got some smaller sections on this side at 2 centimetres. I found really 2 centimetres is as small as you'd really want to go for a pencil. Then I've gone to 3s and 4s. As I say, the width between can be whatever you wish. I've used a pen here to mark these lines. This is an air and water soluble pen, so eventually this will fade. If not, I could use a wet wipe or something like that, and I would be able then to remove these lines. It just makes it much more simpler to make sure I'm stitching in a straight line. And also I am going to start from my folded edge here, and then I am going to come down to the top of our piece. Now the fabric I am using means that this fold here, if we have a look, it's quite springy. You can see it doesn't want to lay flat. As soon as I let it go, it rises up. So due to this springiness, that is one of the reasons I want to start at the base, so I can hold that in place and be secure that as I'm working from this edge forward, I can maintain that even width of that black edge folded forward. I am going to start in the center, and then I will then move out either side. Again, this makes sure we're keeping this area as flat and as even as possible. So I am going to start with a few stitches forward and then back and then forward again. To the end. Now you can go slow here and turn the wheel to make sure you stop exactly where you want on the edge. Then you can press the lever down at the side of these machines to go back and reverse, and a few stitches forward. Then remove the work from underneath the needle and trim the thread ends. So you'll do that for each channel you wish to create. So I'll just do a couple more for you to see. So again, I'm making sure my seam allowance is flat, it's heading down towards the bottom. I've got my foot in place there. I'm going to come forward, I'm going to go back, I'm going to come forward. I'm going to slow at the top edge here so I can control my finishing point. And then reverse and forward again. Needle to the highest point so the work comes easily away from the needle. So it's just a matter now of repeating that process all the way along to either side. So I've now completed all the channels. So now we're going to stitch and enclose these raw edges, folding over our base layer to create a border around the other 3 sides to match the border we have here at the base. Now when we're on a sewing machine, the bulk of the work would normally be here on our left hand side of the machine, so on the table area, so we have room. So in this section of the machine, sort of past the needle, is a very small area, so we try and not to have too much sort of fabric and the bulk of what we're making in that space. So that is why I'm starting here at the bottom. I'm stitching down one short side first, across the top edge and down the other, with the pencil case roll all the time here being on my left hand side of the needle, where we have the machine table to hold the work and keep it nice and flat. So I am folding over now at the base on our crease line, and I'm going to stitch just a couple of mil from this raw edge back to hold this in place. I don't want to stitch too close to this fold, or otherwise this will be all flappy and get in the way. So I'm going to put the center of my raw edge in the center of the toe there on the foot as a guide. So I'm going to stitch forward a few, back a few to make sure it's secure, and then come forward. So we're enclosing that raw edge, folding over on our crease line, nice and steady. Whenever we stop, remember to keep the needle in. Now when we come to this edge here, I am actually going to go back over this. So I'm going to stitch forward to past the top edge. Then I'm going to go back and come forward again, because this area here is going to have a lot of stress when we're putting our pencils or whatever, paintbrushes or whatever we're going to use this for in that space. So I'm just going to reinforce that area. So we're coming forward, past, then I'm going to go into reverse, and we're going to come forward again. So carrying on down towards our corner. So I'm going to fold this so that my side panel is on the top, which is the same as what we have here on the base. Yeah, the side panel came forward on top of the long panel. It could go that way, but I want it to match what's on the bottom. So I'm going to make sure the long edge is underneath and the short edge is sitting on top. And likewise, to make sure we've got all this attached, I'm going to stitch all the way to the end. Then I'm going to stitch in reverse before I start coming down this edge. So all the way down to the end, then into reverse. Then I'm going to just check when I turn it around, leaving the needle in, so make sure our work is secure. On the machines here in uni, we've got a knee lift which raises the foot. On a domestic, you have a lever at the back. You can turn the work around so it holds it in place, and we start coming down this edge. But again, I'm going to go into reverse, and then I'm going to come forward. So our corners will have stitching across and down to make sure they are secure. So here now along our long edge, this raw edge in the center of my toe as a guide. As I say, we know how much to fold over because we've pressed this in place. We have a nice crease there. So the pressing has done all the work for us here, making this process that much easier. So again, as we come to this corner, I want my short edges to be sitting on top. So I'm going to fold that over, come all the way off to the edge and in reverse, needle in, turn our corner. I'm going to go back to the edge and then come forward. So now we're coming down the third side, which is our second short side. Again, when we come to the top of our little holder, I'm going to come past and then just go into reverse for some extra security. And then down to the end and go into reverse. And trim our thread ends. And notice then I still have a couple here. So it's important to keep the work clean as we progress through the stages. So there we have our pencil roll complete. All we need to work out now is how we're going to close it once it's rolled, so we need to attach a little bit of ribbon. So for our fastening, as we are looking at the roll, I'm going to place it on the left hand side. So I'm going to turn it over, so we're going to work from the back of our roll. Now the ribbon I have is very narrow, so if I was to fold it directly on top of one another, it would only be sort of one stitch or maybe two that's going to hold that in place. So I am going to put them side by side to get more stitches across here to make sure it is anchored more securely onto our roll. Now I have a 90 centimeter length of ribbon, which I have folded in half. So this is my fold point here, and I'm going to sort of approximately put it in line with the top of our holder there. So we're just going to scissor that open slightly. Then on top of the stitching we've already done, we're just going to come forward, we're going to go back, and we're going to come forward again. We will trim our thread ends. So there we have our ribbon attached. So if we were to put our pencils or whatever we want in our holder, we would roll from this side. Then we have our ribbon to go around either way, cross at the back, back around to the front to create a bow. So you have to make an allowance for the fact that if your pencil roll was full, that there's enough ribbon to tie the bow. Once you've finished your pencil roll and you're happy with that, you might find you want to up the skill level and consider some alternatives. So here's one that I've started, same principles of construction, but here I have a zip pocket, so we can put some sort of chunkier items in, a reel of tape, sharpener, post-it notes. I put a ruler in there. You could even put sewing kit or, you know, a multitude of things there. Keep the zip compartment though on the opposite side to your tie. It just makes it easier when we start to fold and roll on that side. Also here I've used a nylon zip. It meant I could stitch over the teeth here at the bottom because my zip was a little bit long, because this was just one that I had here. I didn't sort of buy one special. So that's something to consider if you can't get the right length zip. Make sure it's nylon teeth, and if you can very carefully, if you turn the wheel at the side, you can stitch over there to enclose that there. So that's something then you sort of can progress on from our starting point there to increase your skill level with putting in a zip and the extra pocket if you want to take it a step further.